Hi, Rich. Welcome to the Leaders Lab.
Ken, great to be with you today.
Yeah, I'm excited to meet you. I was just telling you briefly. I had pulled up your profile on LinkedIn to learn a little bit more about you. I obviously have your bio, and I've heard you on lots of podcasts, and you of course have 8 books out now, I think. But I don't know if I've ever seen someone's career point in one direction for so long and so with such consistency. Right? It looked like you knew you wanted to be a strategic leader from early on. At least that's the way it looks on paper. Can you maybe tell us a little bit more about your background and how it led you to where you are now?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm going to date myself here a little bit, Ken.
Sure.
I grew up in a time where there were no travel sports teams. So when you wanted to play sports, you got folks together in your neighborhood. You went and knocked door to door. You got kids to play baseball during the spring. You played football in the fall. You played basketball. You did some wrestling. You played some street hockey in the winter. And so one of the things I grew up loving to compete. And it really was the joy of competition. Like I said, there weren't travel teams really per se. Played some high school sports and stuff, but really just loved to compete. And so as I graduated my undergrad in business, one of the things I kept thinking about was I'm not good enough to be a professional athlete. So how do I take that love of competition and turn that into something that I can provide value to other people with? So, back then I was really, I went through a case study, a Harvard Business Review case study, and I'll never forget it. It was around Kodak, and everybody knows the Kodak case study, and how they didn't succeed. And what I really loved about that was the idea that the ability for somebody to think or to outthink the competition could allow them to provide jobs to other people, to help their family grow, to grow a company. So this idea of outthinking other people really sparked my interest. And so I started working in marketing and was doing a strategic planning session, the typical 2-day offsite, and was at a coffee break. And one of the managers came up and said, I just had my performance review, Rich, and my boss said I'm too tactical. I need to be more strategic. How do I do that? So, Ken, at that point, there were a lot of books. And again, this is about 25, 28 years ago, a lot of books on corporate strategy, business unit strategy, but really nothing on a roadmap for the individual person to go from tactical to strategic. So that was my light bulb moment that, hey, I can take my love of competition in sports and in business and bring that together and really help people think, plan, and act strategically.
How did you parlay what was probably a light bulb moment where you're like, hey, there is a path here, right? This does align, but you're still in this other role. How do you go from that to, okay, this is viable. I can actually make money doing it. How did you pivot?
Yeah. So one of the things I did, and I just happened onto this process, and have since formalized it, but I call it purpose channeling. So what I did was I went back through different periods of my life and said, when were the times I was the most fulfilled, the most excited about what I was doing? Not successful, not failure, but when was I the most excited? And so I looked back through those themes and I found things like competition, preparation, were things that were bubbling up to the top. So then what I did is I started talking to people and people in all different walks of life. So people in the graphic arts community, musicians, scientists, people who are engineers. And I was talking to them about this idea of how do you take this theme and do something and channel it in a way that's purposeful. So long story short, after lots of conversations, lots of research, I realized there were a couple different paths. And so marketing was one path, finance was another path. And so I'm going to go down that marketing path. So wound up doing a lot of studying there, went back, got my graduate degree in marketing strategy, did some postgraduate studies in strategy, started teaching at the graduate level, and then really at that point said, I want to make this my life's work. And again, this is about 23, 24 years ago. And so just started doing research and started writing because I'm a big believer for anyone that in order to think, you need to be able to write. And you don't have to be Ernest Hemingway, but if you can take your thoughts and put them on paper, even in bullet points, it helps you crystallize what do I know? And then just as importantly, what don't I know?
You know what's crazy? Well, not crazy to you. I guess it's just gonna emphasize what you're saying, but um, I cannot strategically think in front of a computer. To your point, if I mean, maybe a little bit, but it's like really ineffective, right? So if I'm sitting there and I've got an Excel spreadsheet up and it's got different columns and I'm like trying to create a roadmap or a process map or something like that, I have to just get out of there. I didn't really know that earlier. It was more, and then at some point the light bulb went off and I went like, no, I need to shut everything off and go sit somewhere. I will use an iPad, but I'll do it with a pencil. You know what I mean? And I only do that
Yes.
so I can send myself the note and everything. But yeah, there's a flow to that. And I actually love that time because I feel like it's so weird when, and I guess we'll get to this, but all leaders have an element of being tactical, right? And all
Yes.
leaders should have an element of being strategic. And I enjoy strategy because that's what's going to move the needle, right? It's like, oh my gosh, like, we're figuring something out. And I used to not really make the time for it, right? Because there's always stuff to do. There's always business cards to shuffle and people to
Yeah.
call back and meetings to go to. But I actually cherish that time now, that downtime of just being able to think that way,
Ken, I love what you said there because it's something that very few people do. It's that discipline to take that time and carve it out into your schedule. Like you said, if we are able to do that, you start to build this affinity that you cherish, like you said, you cherish that time.
Yeah.
And I also really appreciated what you said too. I think there's definitely something to the tactical element of creativity and thinking strategically. So whether it's a pencil, like you said, a pen for an iPad, but being able to sit and to think, it seems like today we're on such an activity treadmill all the time, just going and going, that we almost feel guilty when we take a few minutes to stop and reflect and think about what are we doing? Why are we doing it? How could we be doing it better? So I
Right.
love what you said there about, it's like, I think it's a great tip for everyone is take time, carve it out in your calendar, and then go off, get out, move away from the computer, find a comfortable place, get outside if you can, and allow your imagination and some of your intuition to play a role into your business strategy as well.
Yeah, I think we're uncomfortable as a society with being slow. And I think we're uncomfortable with being bored, for lack of a better word, right? So it's like, what, I'm just supposed to sit here? Like, what if nothing comes up, right? And it's like, but something will come up if you create the environment to do it, right? But talk to me a little bit about, so as you're going through this and you leave corporate and you start your own firm,
Mhm.
was that scary for you to like move? I mean, because you were in high level roles before that, I'm sure making really good money. What was that process like? Or did you feel like you were just established enough to where you're just going to go for it?
Yeah, no, I did not feel established
Mhm.
enough. I don't think I'm not sure you ever feel established enough to your point. But what I did, and again, strategy oftentimes times we think about the longer term view. And so one of the things I did do was and when I do executive coaching, I asked the CEOs or C-suite people I work with this question a lot is what's your end game? When you're 70, 75, 80, whatever it is, 60, 65, and you're gonna hang it up and you're gonna just, fish or golf or do whatever you want to do, where do you see yourself? And so I posed that question to myself and I said, I see myself running my own business. I don't
Mhm.
see myself working for somebody else because I have some ideas which I think I can turn into books and products and things like that. So at that point, even though it was, 23 years ago, I did say long term, my end game is I'll be working for myself. So that's another thing. And you mentioned it earlier too, just this idea of carving out time. I think we need to carve out time, not just to think about what are we doing today, but really think about where do we want to be in 5, 10, 15,
Yeah.
20 years, and how do we start positioning ourselves today so that we can be in that point. I'm a big believer that if you don't design your life, life designs you. And so I think we've got to be intentional about carving that time out, like you said, and then thinking not just about the current state, but about our future state.
No, that's such a good point. I agree completely. I think that, and I've fallen victim to what I'm talking about, but I think a lot of us are addicted to more, right? So if we're in a job, who cares if it's the right fit necessarily, right? It's I'm in this job and it's now my job to get promoted. And it's like, well, if you get promoted, now you got to travel to, sub level cities and
Right.
say it, the La Quinta or whatever, you know what I mean?
Yes.
And eat crappy food and be gone from your family 3 nights a week. But it's like we don't even think of the outcome sometimes. We're just, I know early in my corporate career, I was like, I don't care. I just want the next thing, and I'll put in the time and I'll roll up my sleeves. But to your point, you already knew by the time you broke off on your own that, hey, I know where my North Star is, where my gifts are,
Mhm.
and where I want to go. And it doesn't really sound like it was based on, I don't want to, assume anything, but from the way you're talking about it, it was more of a mission. And if the money would come, the money would come, but you weren't making that decision based on like immediate financial impact, right? It was more about long term, quality of life, fulfillment, and things like that. It sounds like.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
As a matter of fact, my wife was actually pregnant with our first child when I made this move. So to your point, I went from a very stable, good salary, good benefits, all of that, good potential future there to the unknown. I took no clients with me, had, didn't have a big stash stashed away, but I believed enough in the direction. And I think that's one of the things that leaders at all levels in all companies need to really understand is what's my belief in where I'm going and my capabilities to get there. And again, there's always going to be doubt. And sure, I wake up at 3 in the morning and I'm worrying about this or that. But the reality is, as a leader, it's our responsibility, whether you're leading a group of just yourself or a group of thousands, you have to have the belief in your strategic direction and the strategy that you've developed that this is going to take me there. There's no guarantees for sure, but you've got to have that belief. And I don't see enough leaders today at all levels with that really deep belief that this is the path we need to be on. And sure, you can change course and you can pivot, but once you set that direction, you've got to have that all in commitment. And I think sometimes people are hedging their bets, but the best strategies can, as you know, always make trade-offs. So you can't spread everything, resources too thin, trying to be everything to everybody. You've got to place your bet. And I think sometimes people just aren't comfortable getting out of the status quo to place that bet.
I agree. I think leaders at all levels, like you're saying, like, even at very high levels, it's, in fact, maybe especially at high levels where there's more to lose, right? There's more to lose. And to carve a new path, to be strategic in an area where maybe a company hasn't been all that strategic before, and kind of say like,
Mhm.
no, this is where we need to go. There's risk to that,
Yes.
right? And I think this is ultimately poor leadership when you're not willing, even if you think it's best for the organization, to put your neck out for fear of your own safety, right? But I do feel like a lot of people get trapped in that. So let's like maybe pivot to that for a second. How can a company, because I feel like so many people do not think strategically. I listened to you on another podcast and you said everybody's capable at some level of thinking strategically, right?
Mhm.
And we've got to create an environment for them to. But how do you pivot? I guess I'll start with an organization
Mhm.
into a more strategic way of thinking for everybody, all the way down to the front line. How do you do that? And then I also want to talk about for individuals, because I've worked with so many really, really gifted people that can do things that I'll never be able to do,
Mhm.
but they won't be able to ask, at least at this stage in their career, they're not able to ask the questions that I'm able to ask, right? Because they're not,
Right.
so they can go get data and do these crazy things and write formulas and do all of this, but they don't actually fully understand like the business application, right?
Mhm.
Or the long-term vision of where it's going.
Well, and I love what you just said there, Ken, because you hit on a foundational aspect of thinking strategically, which is the ability to ask great questions. And what I find is the people who are the most strategic really approach each day, each meeting, each interaction with this explorer's mindset. So they're starting each day saying, there's things I know and there's things I don't know. I'm going to find things today that I don't know. So again, when we think about being strategic, it's really, I define it as possessing insight that leads to advantage. And my simple definition of an insight is a learning that leads to new value. So if we go into each day actively seeking new learnings and then taking time, as you described earlier, taking time to think about how does this learning translate into value for my team, my customers, the people that I work with, that's when we start really connecting the dots. We hear that phrase a lot with strategy, the ability to connect the dots. But that's when we connect the dots. If we're bouncing around from one thing to the next like a bumper car at the carnival, then we're never going to be strategic because I love when people say, "Well, I'm opportunistic." That's typically code for I have no strategy at
It's
all. I'm
reactive.
just
Yeah. Yeah.
exactly
Yeah.
reactive.
Hmm.
So I think to your point, and you hit it on the head, we've got to take the time to think about thoughtful questions, pose those questions, and then go into interactions not ready to respond, but ready to listen and accept new ideas and new learnings. That's what the best leaders do.
Well, and I think, yeah, I think vulnerability then plays a part in it because in order to be in the mindset that you're talking about, you can't come in having all the answers, right? Having all the answers would be the opposite of what we're talking about, right? It's no, I'm coming in to grow and learn and see things for the way they are, good and bad, right? Even about myself sometimes, right? Hey, I made a bad call. We might need to shift directions here, right? And then creating an environment, I guess, that fosters and encourages feedback and yeah, and even rewards it, right?
Yeah, yeah, that idea of vulnerability I think is really important. And coinciding with that is if we're going to be vulnerable, then we're going to have to not have complete control.
Right.
So when we go into a meeting, I see this a lot too when I work with senior leaders who are interacting with their board of directors. In some cases, it's a completely scripted meeting where our SVP here is going to say this script and our SVP here is going to do this presentation. And it's not an interactive dialogue. And I think sometimes then a senior leadership team misses the opportunity to gain insights from the board of directors versus just presenting to them. And I think the same can be said for senior leaders too. If, to your point, if we're not vulnerable, if we're not willing to learn, and we're okay putting ourselves out there that we don't have all the answers, that's when we're going to get the most insights. And that's when you're going to really harness the collective knowledge of your team versus because if we appear that we know it all, then our people are going to shut down and they're not going to share their best thinking with us on a regular basis.
Yeah, that example you just gave in the boardroom, the way I'm envisioning it, being one of the senior VPs in the room is the goal. What it should be is different, but the goal I'm guessing for most of them is get through this untarnished, right?
Right. Yes.
Get the information out in the way that we want to get it out. If they don't ask too many questions, that's probably good, and then we'll
Right.
leave. But no one learned anything from that, right? It was just
You
an
summed it up
exercise in
beautifully.
futility.
You summed it up beautifully. That's exactly it.
Congrats, by the way, on the new book. Inc. said
Thanks.
one of the top 4 books to read this year. That's insane.
Yeah, thanks very much. Again, I was really trying to take this book strategic. And again, what I did is I looked at the people I've been talking to the last 5, 6 years, and I've been fortunate enough to do some executive coaching because of the pandemic. We were on video like this, and I had permission to transcribe a lot of those conversations. And the word that kept coming up time and time again was navigate. I'm having a hard time navigating this competition. I'm having a hard time navigating this new market. And so I wanted to help the folks I was working with. So I did design this framework, this strategic fitness compass. So if you think about a compass, I've got strategy, leadership, organization, communication is my 4 areas. And then within that, a number of tools, techniques, concepts that really help leaders almost provide a checklist to make sure that we're not missing things. Because to your point earlier in the conversation, sometimes we've got leaders who are really good on the business side. Sometimes they're great at building culture. Sometimes they're great communicators, but they're not as good with the financial piece. So I wanted to give leaders almost a comprehensive checklist to say, look, here are the things you need to know on strategy. Here's what we've got to do from a leadership standpoint. Here's what's important organizationally, and here's how we communicate. If we can start to get those four areas pretty well addressed, then I think that gives us a good foundation to build from our skill set. So yeah, I appreciate it. I mean, that's really been the goal for this book, was to give leaders that full approach to developing themselves as true executives.
Really cool. And that is high praise that you've gotten for it. And so congratulations. And was COVID, you mentioned, you got some calls in there around strategy, but I'm just curious, was COVID a boom to your business, or I mean, I would think if there was ever a time to speak with someone on strategy, it would be that. And no matter what the size of business, right? Everybody had to pivot somewhat, anywhere from somewhat to like 180 degrees, right? Um, yeah. So did that help your business, or did you find that people were more frozen and figure it getting more strategic, because that happens a lot too, right? Under duress, a lot of, or not more strategic, but more task oriented. A lot of times under pressure, people go, I don't have the luxury of talking to a strategic thinker, right? I have to pay the bills, make the payroll, and we're drowning over here, right? How did that work with your business?
Yeah, it's funny, Ken. What I've found over the years, and this is going over 2 decades now, is that you go back to the financial crisis, the dot-com bubble, the pandemic. What I've found is there's a small select group of leaders out there, and they work in organizations, they lead companies where they're always hungry to get better. So sometimes they're struggling, sometimes they're doing really well. But at the end of the day, they always have this growth mindset of, how can we be better?
Yeah.
And so that's what I found over the years. Well, like I said, whether it was the dot-com bust, the financial issues in 2008, 2009, the pandemic, whatever issues there's been from a macro environment perspective, the people who are always hungry to get better are the ones I typically work with. I found, and I've been blessed to work across different industries. I've worked with multi-billion-dollar companies. I've worked with small companies, but it's typically the people that say, you know what, we don't know it all. We can get better. And so, to your point, I think one of the things that I see with great teams is, yes, they're aware of the context and the situation, but they're not always prone to those knee-jerk reactions like, oh my gosh, we've got to go to this side. Oh my gosh, we've got to go to this side. If you've got good mission, vision, and values, so if you've got good purpose, if you've got a good business model, again, I think about business model as how we create value, how we deliver value, how we capture value. And then if you have a plan comprised of goals, objectives, strategies, tactics, sure, it's going to change a little bit, but by and large, that's a foundation. That's like one of the Egyptian pyramids. You might polish some of the sides, you might replace some of the bricks, but it's not going anywhere.
Right.
So again, I think, if you've got a house of cards, and I see some businesses that are built like a house of cards, if you don't have a strong foundation, you don't have, and again, I think about strategy like a scaffold with 3 planks. I think about purpose, mission, vision, values. I think about business model, and I think about plan. So if you've got those 3 things in place and you've thought through them and you're dedicated to those, despite what's going on externally, you should be fine. You might have to modify or pivot a little bit, but you should be good.
Yeah, I think, to your point, I mean, situations like that, whatever the crisis is going to expose leadership, or
Yes.
flaws in the leadership foundation, right? And I think if all it is a product pivot or a go-to-market pivot, that's a lot different than like a cultural pivot, right?
Yes.
What are the typical, I know you work with a lot of large companies, but is there a typical size, like when you're working directly with companies? Is it 500 employees and up? Is it 5,000? I mean, what does that look like for you? Or is it all over the place?
Yeah, I would say, I mean, it's typically 500 to 10,000 would be typically the organizations I'm working with. So I know that's a wide spread there, but one of the things I've tried not to do is, because strategic thinking is important across industries, I've tried not to segment myself to say, I'm just going to work with Fortune 500 companies, or I'm just going to work with small, because what I love about what I do is I'm able to see how people in different size companies, different industries think and plan and act strategically. And then what I've tried to do over 20 years is catalog all of those approaches, those tools, those techniques. And now when I work with different organizations, instead of saying, here's the bag of 160, which one do you want? That's
Right.
impossible to go through. I say, there's 160 different ways to do this. Here are the 3 to 5 tools that we're going to use in this day-long session to help your team based on where you're at today.
Right.
I've been blessed to work with a company that started around $90 million and now they're just under $1 billion. And so, there's different challenges that you go through as you scale. So for me, how do you think strategically or how do you plan strategically when you're at 100 million or 500 million or $1 billion? It's the foundation's similar, but you got to think about different things there. So again, I think, the reality is I try to stay, and I think this is something that I would share with others is how are you mentally stimulating yourself day in and day out to stay fully engaged in what you're doing? All the research from Gallup and some of those research companies shows that, there's less than 50% of people are fully engaged at work. Well, part of that's the company's challenge, but I would challenge everybody individually, make it, find ways to be fully engaged. If you're not
Right.
fully engaged, you're wasting your time. And as a strategist, as my wife will tell you, there's nothing that drives me crazier than when we're wasting time. So find a way to get fully engaged, take that challenge on yourself.
That's so important. And I guess playing off of that, I know I heard you talking again on another podcast where you talked about 70% of executives feeling overwhelmed with the
Mhm.
amount of data that's just coming at them. How do you go from, complexity to clarity? And along with that, because I brushed over it quickly earlier, but
Mhm.
because I'm guessing your answer might start to encompass when you're working with people, how do you we've been talking about a lot of things on an organizational level, and I guess I'd like to talk about like on an individual level, like if you're coaching one leader or one person
Mhm.
on engaging that part of their brain that's more strategic. So I guess I just lumped two questions together again, but I'll let you sort that out.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So, I would say that the first thing we need to do is we need to have a great awareness of our situation. So whether it's a company, a business unit, or me as an individual leader, we first need to get a real good understanding of our context. I'm always amazed, you think about medicine and, Ken, if you had an issue with your back and you went to the doctor, you got into the exam room and she didn't ask any questions, she didn't take any tests, she just wrote a prescription, handed it to you and left. You would think that's crazy because in medicine, a doctor always has to diagnose before they prescribe a medication. But in business, what I see a lot is people prescribing new activities, new tactics, new projects without really diagnosing, okay, what's going on around us? Let's take a good look at that. So, the one tool I would recommend, and it's simple, anybody can do it out there, is the contextual radar. So just draw a circle on a piece of paper, draw a line from top to bottom, a line from left to right. So you've got 4 quadrants of your radar, and then label one of them market, then customers, then competition, then company. And then really just jot down what's happening in each of those areas for you. So whether you're the CEO, whether you're a district manager, whether you're a sales rep, whether you're a marketing manager, that applies to everybody. What's going on from your perspective in the business? And then start to talk with other people about their perspective. So your colleagues, customers, or clients, what are they seeing in the market? What are they seeing within their own company? Now we're talking about ways to generate insight. So I do believe that strategic thinking from a business and a personal perspective always starts with getting a good understanding of your context. So you can use that radar. I'm also a big believer in setting strategy from a personal level. So you can take that radar, instead of putting market, customers, competitors, company, you can put mind, body, spirit, and relationships. And think about what's important to you currently in each of those areas. Body, are you exercising? Mind, are you meditating? Are you doing gratitude journaling? Spirit, are you volunteering in the community? Are you helping others? So, that's, I think, one way to think strategically for ourselves is to do that personal radar, mind, body, spirit, relationships, and start to understand then what's exciting in there. As I think about everything happening in my life, where am I drawn to? And am I putting enough time and energy there? That's one thing I think we could all do, myself included, do a better job of, is really understanding what's really resonating with us right now, and take time, take energy and move it to that area.
Right.
Instead, we're spending too little time on the areas where we generate the most value.
Scott, such a good point. That one relates to me really, really well. I was a COO of a mastermind of executives, and this was a few years ago. But the guy that created it created something really, really cool. And first of all, we had a thing called a one sheet, which was all your goals and everything for the year, and
Mhm.
it had even more than that. But to get to the one sheet, the first thing that you did is we broke things out into gardens of life, right? This was the idea of this mastermind, was like a whole life thing, not just make money, not just be healthy,
Yeah.
but to kind of try to have it all, right? So the idea was eight gardens of life. I think it's seven or eight, and the four that you just mentioned were on there, right? And along with that was, I think, like travel and adventure. So some that weren't,
Yeah.
that you could fit in there, but relationships, and then romantic relationship, that kind of thing. Those would be two different ones.
Mhm.
Finance and career would be two different ones, like that kind of thing.
Yep.
And then to set your goals according to what was going to, it's sort of like they say, the rising tide lifts all boats, right? I mean, there's times where if I was 50 pounds overweight and that was affecting my self-esteem, my love life, my health, and maybe even to some degree my career, because my energy was low or whatever,
Yeah.
then by accomplishing that one task, I might be able to lift, four of these areas up at the same time, right?
Yes.
Um, but but without that level of strategic thinking of even going, a but I think our brains are wired to safety and to ease, and not
Mhm.
to necessarily deal with the biggest problem in the room, right?
Yes.
And so without strategic thinking, even on a daily, I mean, I was just thinking about this. I did a seminar yesterday for our team on just time blocking and setting up your calendar in advance for the week, and being very specific and intentional with your time,
Hmm.
and allowing time for things like what we're talking about. And I think if we don't do that, I mean, I guess I just speak for myself. When I don't do that, I'm all over the place. If I'm not proactive, I'm reactive. There is no middle ground, right? I mean,
Right.
I'm either designing the day, or like you said, you plan it, you plan your life,
Yes.
and and so we talked about that even at the individual contributor level, or especially at the individual contributor level. It's like, what are you trying to get done here? Why are you trying to get it done?
Yes.
And what does it mean? And if I don't do that in advance, which I don't always do, I mean,
Sure.
I can look back on any day I have that was not very effective, and it has directly to it is directly equatable to the amount of time I spent into planning it.
Great point. I love that point, because it, I think, especially when it comes to meetings, and we all have lots of meetings, the lack of planning for meetings is the reason why 80% of executives say that meetings are not productive use of their
Right.
time. So
Right.
I love what you said there about, taking the time to plan out what you're going to do. And, to build on that idea, one thing I've seen really successful leaders do is they minimize the number of mental transitions that they have during the day. So they do that by batching things of a similar nature. So for you, it might be, I'm going to record all of my podcasts on Monday and Tuesday. Then Wednesday, I'm going to focus on client work. Thursday, I'm going to focus on writing and creating. And then Friday is going to be, operations and logistics. Now, look, we don't live in a perfect world, and those schedules get muddled up. But having the discipline, like you said, to plan your time out during the week, and especially if you can batch certain things and cut down the number of mental transitions, it really energizes how we're able to approach each day, I think.
God, I love that term, mental transitions. I love that. That's sticking in my head now for
Yeah.
forever. You've stuck it in there. So thank you.
Good.
No, I really do like it, because it's a mental transition, which also kind of becomes a physical transition, right? Because I mean, you got to start over, you got to set new things up. And I think I try to do it, but I think being more aware of this term now, I'm going to be much more like diligent about it.
Yeah, sure.
I also think understanding yourself and knowing. when you're effective, like different times of days, I'm better at certain things. I do all of my team meetings back to back to back early in the day.
Yep.
And it's when I have my highest energy. I do not want to jump on Zoom at 3 or 4 in the afternoon. I'm done. I'm
Right.
done. They're all
Right.
done. Now, sometimes it looks like I'm a crazy man up till about noon because they're all happening, but then I'm done.
Yes.
Then I get to, and like you said, I don't have got the headphones on, got the mic on, got the screen on, got the coffee
Yeah.
here. Don't got to move around a whole bunch to make all that happen in a fast way.
Excellent.
Um, well, very, very good. It's been amazing, amazing talking with you. Anything else for our audience before we, kind of wind down here?
Ken, I think the one thing I would leave folks with is if you want to grow individually as a person or you want to grow your business, you need to continually stimulate or catalyze your thinking with new sources. So that's either people, it's books, it's journals, it's websites, it's documentaries. But we have to, and you said it beautifully earlier, a lot of times we fall into this comfort zone of the status quo. And what I've found is the leaders that I've been most drawn to in my career are the ones that are continually intentional about new sources to stimulate their thinking. So that would be the thing I think. And then just to build on what you said earlier, if when you stimulate that thinking, then carving out time in your calendar to sit down to digest all of that new stimulation and say, how do I translate this into value for the people that I serve?
I love that. I love that. And this talk, I don't know. I'm very excited by this subject. I mean, again, because this for me is where fulfillment comes from.
Yes.
Running the playbook is nice sometimes. You get some wins there and stuff, but developing it
Mhm.
in a way that's going to impact other people and yourself and your company and your customers. I mean, that to me is where the good stuff is, right? And so learning how to get better at that and perfect that and flex that muscle a lot more is right up my alley. So thanks for coming on and teaching us a little bit more about it.
Thanks, Ken. It was great to be with you.
Yeah, congrats on all your success and the book. And we'll put all the ways to contact you in our show notes. Thanks so much, Rich.
Thanks, Ken. I really enjoyed the conversation.
All right, take care.